Yes. Yes, it was. Hello and welcome back to Bookish, and welcome to a video inspired by, recent efforts by the President of the United States to change exhibits and displays and information being presented at the Smithsonian Institute, various history museums run, at least indirectly, by the United States government, and particularly his statements about slavery and how they seem to overemphasize slavery. So that's kind of led to a response or a backlash and a discussion about slavery once again here in the United States. And so I thought I would answer the question, was slavery really that bad? And like I said, I've already answered the question. But I do want to talk about this issue and kind of talk about why. And kind of, go through some basic information about American history and the history of slavery in the United States, in the hopes of clearing some of these things up and understanding how slavery actually worked and understanding why even so-called good slave owners were actually perpetrating an evil. So before I do that, let me clear up a couple of things. Number one, I don't think any person alive today needs to feel guilty about slavery. We didn't do that stuff. That wasn't us. That was future or past generations of Americans. We don't need to feel guilty about it. At the same time, I believe we have a responsibility to be honest about it, to explore the issue, to put the information out there, and a responsibility to make sure that we know that we messed up and we know that there are things that we need to fix in our society, a responsibility to make things better, to finally, at some point, to repair the damage done by slavery and Jim Crow and segregation that followed it. That is our responsibility, not to feel guilty. One of the things that amuses me about the right, when they talk about these things, is they say they shouldn't be made to feel guilty, and then they act guilty. They act like they demean things like Juneteenth as being unimportant and think it shouldn't be a national holiday. They demean Black History Month and act like that we shouldn't have a whole month for that. They celebrate the other side, the Confederacy, in the Civil War oftentimes, and they act like they're guilty, and the efforts to kind of cover up or diminish or reduce historical conversations about that in our museums, in our schools, is an example of what a guilty person would do. You're not guilty. Stop acting guilty. Start taking responsibility for telling the truth and putting the truth out there. The other thing I would say is to kind of address some of the apologists for the United States past history with slavery, is that it doesn't matter what happened anywhere else in regard to slavery. Slavery happened in the United States. The type of slavery practiced in the United States and in the American colonies before it became the United States was somewhat unique to the United States of America, and it doesn't matter that slavery existed all over the world before. It doesn't matter that other countries kept going with slavery longer than we did. It doesn't matter that slavery, was practiced in Africa by people from African civilizations. None of that matters, because in the United States what matters is our history with slavery. So don't come in the comments and tell me about, it was people in Africa who sold other Africans into slavery. Yes, I know that. People in Africa practiced slavery long before we did. Yes, I know that. Okay, everybody knows that. That's not the issue. The issue is how we talk about, deal with, take responsibility for making sure that we are open and honest about our past with slavery. That's what matters. That's what matters. So real quickly, slavery as practiced in the United States of America was chattel slavery. That means that a person was enslaved for their whole life and that slavery was hereditary. You pass that condition down to your kids. The United States is the only country to practice chattel slavery, but it does make slavery in the United States somewhat different. And in the United States, slavery was based solely on race. I know a lot of you are going to tell me that, white people were enslaved through indentured servitude in the early days of the American colonies. And yes, you can call it that. And yes, indenturing yourself and becoming essentially someone's servant for 7 to 11 years was like slavery, and oftentimes those indentured servants were treated really badly. But here's the difference. Indentured servitude ended. Indentured servitude ended when your time was up, and you did not pass that condition down to your child, and that condition of servitude was not based on your race. By the time we get to around 1620, 1619 or so, the rules for slavery in the United States are in place. It's hereditary, and it's based solely on race, and it's inheritable through your mother. This is an important thing, and one of those things that should be really disturbing to us, because slavery being inherited through your mother means that no matter who your father was, aka a white guy who raped your enslaved mother, you were still property. You were still considered to be an enslaved person, and that's an important aspect of understanding how slavery in the United States worked. So slavery in the United States really kind of kicked off when it was discovered that tobacco was a viable cash crop in places like Virginia and Maryland, and rice was a viable cash crop in places like South Carolina. That's when slavery really kicked in, because what large landowners needed to make money from their land, which is after all the primary reason why people came to the Americas, was to make money. What they needed to make money from their land was to produce something they could sell, and they needed to produce it in large quantities, and so they needed a lot of laborers. Tobacco is really labor intensive, and so what became the solution to the labor problem was to buy enslaved people who'd been captured in Africa or sold into slavery in Africa, and buy them and put to work on tobacco plantations. Tobacco is a land and labor intensive product. Go to Mount Vernon, George Washington's house, and you could learn all about how the tobacco process worked there. Okay, so it requires a lot of slaves, and eventually, because enslaving people was cheaper because it's permanent, unlike indentured servitude, slavery replaced and kind of outstripped indentured servitude as the primary way in which landowners could get cheap labor, which landowners could get the labor they needed to produce tobacco. And up until around 1819, 1820, that's kind of how slavery was working. And to be honest with you, because of innovations and tobacco not being as great a cash crop, by the 1800s as it was in the 16 and 1700s, in lots of places, even in Virginia and Maryland, slavery was becoming one of these things which was unfashionable and less economically necessary. Cotton becoming the cash crop of the South, as Eli Whitney and innovations and people moved south and west, changed the nature of slavery. Under the old tobacco system, oftentimes in the rice system in South Carolina, oftentimes slavery worked on what's called the task system. An enslaved person had a certain amount of work they had to get done every single day. And if they got that work done before the day was over, they essentially had free time. This is why in places like South Carolina and other places you see a culture developing among enslaved people that involved art and music and all kinds of religion and all kinds of things taking place, because this task system meant that there was the opportunity to earn free time by working really hard and getting all your work done. Now, slave owners didn't want their slaves to have free time for all kinds of reasons, but one reason would be because that means they are essentially have enslaved people who are producing nothing for them. Okay? That kind of changes, and particularly changes when we start seeing the cotton economy of Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and other places. As cotton takes over as the primary cash crop, that system goes away. Because cotton is a crop in the places where it could be grown, more than once a year, and cotton had a perfect growing partner. And its perfect growing partner was corn. So literally, corn and cotton take different nutrients out of the soil, which means that a plantation owner or a farmer in Mississippi could plant cotton on a field, for one growing season, and then corn on the field immediately afterwards. And then cotton again and corn again. This meant that fields rarely or did not have to lie fallow very often, which meant there was always work for enslaved people to do, preparing fields, planting, processing, etc. Always work to do, whether it was cotton or corn. This changed the nature of slavery. This, in lots of ways, made slavery more work intensive. So what that meant was that cotton plantation owners and people who own big plantations, people who own farms with slaves, they made money by growing cotton. The more cotton they grew, the more money they made. But to grow more cotton, they needed more workers, they needed more land, which meant they invested a lot of money in their enslaved people so they could produce more. This meant that the economy of the cotton growing South meant that slave owners had to try to get every single penny they could of productivity out of their slaves. This meant that slave owners in the cotton economy fed their slaves as little as they could. They worked their slaves sun up to sundown and then some. They housed their slaves under poor conditions. They clothed their slaves at a minimum necessary. And they sold their slaves away when their productivity went down, because this is just the economics of slavery. And this really is where I think we have our ideas about, kind of the horrors of slavery taking place. And there is some truth in that. But the thing about slavery, no matter what kind of slavery it is that slavery is in and of itself awful. Because slavery deprives people of the right of self-determination, deprives people of the right of freedom to do as they see fit. From a purely labor point of view, it deprives them of the right to work to make their lives better. Enslaved people are literally working to make the lives of their owners better, and they are using up their life. They're using up their skills, they're using up their time, they're using up their energy, whatever it is, they're using that up in the service of someone else who is literally working them to death. So enslaved people lived short lives full of work in which they were, never full, never comfortable, never warm in the winter, always hot in the summer, and they were constantly engaged in this life of work. Okay? That's kind of what becomes true of slavery with the cotton economy. But even in the old tax system economy, you still see people, enslaved people, rebelling because they want their freedom. Because what human beings want is freedom. What they want is their talent and work to go, towards their own ends or towards their own benefit, not towards someone else's. That's why we still had slave rebellions in places like South Carolina and Virginia, even though we're not talking about really the cotton economy there, because people want freedom and slavery deprives them of that. And then on top of that, you have this brutal economic system, which essentially works people to death, keeps them hungry, keeps them cold, keeps them working, which goes along with the cotton economy. So, bad on top of bad. On top of that, of course, as property, enslaved people didn't have the right to refuse to work. If they did, they could be beaten, they could be harmed in some other way. If they were rebellious and refused to work, the punishment might not fall on them, but on their wife or on their children. If they're rebellious and refused to work, they could be sold away from their family, from their wife, from their kids. By the way, this happened anyway. Guess why? Slave owners sold enslaved people's wives, kids, husbands away? Because it was economically wise for them. Think about those kids who are born to enslaved people on plantations. They become an asset of the owner, something the owner can deal with and do away with or use to however he sees fit. And as those kids grow up, if 1 year the owner's financial system looks bad, he can recoup a loss. He can recoup operating expenses by selling these children who are valuable, who could be sold off to other people. And this creates then separated families and estranged families, and just the nightmare of not being able to protect your children as a parent would be part of the horror of being involved in slavery. For enslaved women, there was no protection from sexual violence, from sexual advances. Essentially, any white man who happened by the farm, the plantation, where you were enslaved could take advantage of you, and there would be no repercussions. Any child born from that rape, from that sexual assault, would become an enslaved person, and it would be completely up to the slave owner to decide how to treat them. These are the nightmares that exist in slavery. Okay, so was slavery that bad? Let's see. You don't have freedom. You don't get to work to benefit yourself, but to benefit someone else, and it's unending. That's your entire life. Your life is short. You're hungry. You're cold. You're ill-housed. You're poorly clothed. Your family can be taken away from you. You can be the subject of physical violence. You can be the subject of sexual violence, and you don't control any of that. That is a nightmare situation. So was slavery really all that bad? Absolutely. So since this is a BookTube channel, I wanted to discuss 10 books that I would recommend to you to read if you wanted to learn more about slavery. I think this is one of the things that is key to preventing this kind of anti-woke, I guess, approach to our reaction to history that seems to be originating with President Trump, is to read and to learn. So the first three books are slave narratives. The first is a narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, easily the most famous of these books, in which Frederick Douglass, who goes on to be a leading abolitionist, a leading agitator, a leading voice speaking out against slavery in the 1840s, 50s, 60s, he writes about his life as an enslaved person in Maryland. There's also 12 Years a Slave by Solomon Northup, which really I think gives real insight into what slavery was like in what we call the Deep South. Northup ends up being kidnapped into slavery, even though he was a free man, and ends up working on a plantation in a really remote area of Louisiana, where the real kind of what we think about as the nightmares of slavery, beating, sexual assaults, endless work, no place to run away, and it gives some real insight into that. Incidents in the Life of the Slave Girl by Harriet Jacobs, just a great book which details the problems that enslaved women faced in terms of sexual advances, in terms of having to depend on others perhaps to protect themselves, protect their families. Just a really, really great book. The next two books are all books that are. The next book is really the most academic book on the list, and that's Down by the Riverside by Charles Joyner. Charles Joyner was the father of BookTube's own Hannah Joyner, and he wrote really what I think is just one of the most important kind of foundational histories of slavery, particularly on the Gulf Coast of South Carolina, where the primary crop was rice. Now, this will give you some insight into the way in which the task system worked, and the way in which slaves, were expected to work, and how much work they were expected to do, etc. And because that system worked on the task system, you also then, this is one of the things that Joyner was most interested in, it was the culture created by these enslaved people, and how they kind of used that culture to survive that condition of enslavement, and how various things changed that over time. Just a really great book with a lot to say about slavery. The next two books are about enslaved people who belonged to or were the property of founding fathers. The first one I mentioned is Never Caught, which is, I'm reading the book over here, The Washington's Relentless Pursuit of Their Runaway Slave Owner Judge. Is by Erica Armstrong Dunbar, and it literally tells the story of this enslaved woman named Ona Judge who escaped from George Washington, and he spent essentially the rest of his life trying to get her returned to him, and so she lived a long portion of her life trying to evade capture by agents of George Washington. A much more detailed and also really academic work on this is The Hemingses of Monticello by Annette Gordon Reed, which tells the story of the Hemings family, most famously Sally Hemings, who Thomas Jefferson raped and fathered children with, and how her family was treated on the Jefferson property. This gives you, I think, kind of shatters ideas we might have had, or that people like to promote about the founding fathers and their ideas of freedom and commitment to equality. And Jefferson was really troubled by slavery. He may have been troubled by slavery, but he wasn't troubled by the way he treated his slaves. Wasn't troubled by having slaves beaten. He wasn't troubled by selling slaves. This is something he and his father and then his inheritors of his property did. They freed slaves and whatever, but they made the decisions that were best for them. And that, I think, really comes through in that book. And also the desire for freedom of Sally Hemings' mother, for her children, Sally Hemings' desire for freedom for his children, and so on, really comes through in that book. Let's see, I think the next five books, is it five? No, the next four books are all works of fiction. The first of those would be Let Us Descend by Jesmyn Ward. This is the latest book by Jesmyn Ward, and it really looks at the issue of slavery as it affected enslaved women from a very young age, and how they were at risk, at danger from sexual predation by owners or other white men on plantations from almost the moment of getting near puberty till they were old or dead. And this young woman decides to escape from this situation and to try to raise her child in a situation of freedom. And it's a fictional story, but it kind of, I think, tells a really effective story, gives some real insights into this, the issue of slavery in the South. Let's see, the next book on the list I would have you read that's a work of fiction is The Known World by Edward P. Jones. This is just a great book, which really, I think, does a tremendous amount to kind of give insights into slavery and the way it affected the psychology of enslaved people and perhaps their enslavers. One of the unique aspects of The Known World is that some of the slave owners in that novel are actually black land owners who have owned enslaved people as well. And by having some of the characters be that, I think it kind of actually highlights the dehumanizing nature of slavery even more, because it kind of just shows it, I think, more as an economic situation which creates really tense or really difficult relationships between people, not just based on race, even though that's certainly it, but also based on power, etc. And the desire perhaps of people to fit into the situation and to define success the way the society they live in defines it. Third of these fictional books would be Underground Railroad by Colson and Whitehead, which just has a really searing depiction of slavery in I believe Georgia or one of the Carolinas, with sexual violence, the reality of life on plantations, and then it kind of shifts as one of the enslaved women escapes. It kind of shifts into this kind of almost kind of, well, I don't want to use the term magical realism, let's just say fantastic view of the Underground Railroad, which gives insight into slavery in other places, and then the history of racism and segregation and violation of rights of black people by American society moving forward. Just another really great book. And then finally, I think kind of the ultimate book about slavery, what I consider to be one of the greatest American novel, is Beloved by Toni Morrison, which shows the incredible depravity and warping nature of slavery, what it does to the enslaved, what it does to their view of life and family, etc., how literally slavery haunts them, or the past of American slavery and plantation life haunts them, and then how it haunts us moving forward. Just a really, really great book. Anyway, there you go. There's my kind of lecture about slavery and why slavery was that bad, with 10 book recommendations for reading about slavery here in the United States. I look forward to your comments in the comment section below, and as always, thank you for watching.